Well, sort of, yeah. It's about 4 hours north.
So it's colder there, I heard.
Well, it's colder, and we have 10 feet of snow all the time. And not
So
literally,
you
but
used
a lot
to
of
this?
snow. I am used to this, unfortunately. That doesn't mean I like it.
Me either,
Yeah.
I wish I could.
Yeah, seriously. Well, so are you from Taipei?
Yeah.
Yeah,
You ever been to
I
Taiwan?
have.
How
I've
many
been
times?
just once, but I spent about 2 weeks there, so I saw everything.
Just for like business or?
No, it was during Chunjie. You know, we had, as a professor, I had like 6 weeks off. So I went to Taiwan for 2 weeks, and I went to Vietnam for 2 weeks or something. But so I did Taipei for a long time. I had friends there, and then Kunming and Kaohsiung, and then up into the mountains and what's that? You know, one of the famous national parks with all the incredible rock formations, and then along the coast.
Oh,
And
you
everything.
went to Hualien.
Yes, yeah. Thank you. Well, yeah. So yes,
You know, it's like people really different from China and Taiwan.
they are very different.
Like
Yeah. Taiwanese people are much nicer.
Keep going.
Yeah. Well, it's friendlier, warmer, right? So likely to help you out, likely to be polite on the street and polite in the subway, whereas in mainland China it's just total chaos. And no one's very nice.
I know the Beijing, and I remember like when we asked for direction on the street, people they seem really bothered.
They don't want to talk to you. Yeah, yeah.
I don't know. It's
Shove you out of the way.
I don't understand
Careful.
why.
They got 1 billion people, and it's a difficult life.
You know, very sad.
Taiwan, I think, is a little more relaxed.
So, one second. And so you have lots of nice food, I guess.
I mean, of course. Well, everybody talks about the street markets.
Oh, did you?
Of course, yeah, and like every night, right? Well, one of them was within walking distance of wherever we were staying. But I actually like all kinds of Chinese food. So.
The Beijing actually has very good food too. Beijing duck.
Yeah, Beijing kaya, and then they have this noodle thing, traditional style. There's a lot. I mean, every city has good stuff. Excuse me.
Beijing is more like global, it's more international. I think it's not really. I think the entire city is not really making progress.
I don't know. I mean, I was there in 2010, so I can't really speak for progress, but it seemed very nice.
So Ethan, the first question I'd like to ask you is like, because Trump and like his people, they said it's very likely they're going to increase like tariffs on like imports from China, right? So there might be a trade war. And some people, they argue this is going to disrupt like a global supply chain. And like a lot of, big companies, they're thinking, wow, if it's going to be, if everything, like all the material import from China going to be so expensive, then we probably should just move our factory somewhere and we can get cheaper material. And what do you think about that?
So there's a lot to unpack in those possibilities. Certainly, I mean, what you just described might be something relatively close to a worst-case scenario, which is possible. I mean, that may come to pass. However, I think that the most reasonable interpretation of Trump's rhetoric during the campaign and what has continued even till now is that it's sort of a negotiating position. It's a sort of shot across the bow of both China and maybe the U.S. Congress and the status quo, in as much as he intends to be more forceful. Again, this is all speculation, but he intends to be more forceful in some way, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the worst-case scenario that you just described is going to come to pass, 45% tariff on all Chinese goods, et cetera, as some sort of retroactive punishment for the trade relationship over the last 20 or 30 years. One of the reasons that I would suspect that it's not going to come to that level, well, there's two reasons. One, the Republican Party in the U.S. Congress is not likely to go along with that, period. And although the Office of the Executive in the U.S. is granted quite a bit of sort of statutory power to deal with trade relationships and deal with trade treaties and impose tariffs, Congress is going to have a say in this, and they have the ability to resist it. I think it's pretty likely. I mean, this goes against Republican ideology. It goes against free trade ideology and basic right? So right now you have Donald Trump tweeting as a sort of industrial policy in an almost authoritarian way, trying to push American companies into doing his will, which is a sort of, that's a authoritarian, almost socialist way of handling business is almost more like what would happen in China, whereas the traditional free market capitalism here suggests that you shouldn't be doing that, right? Politicians shouldn't be demanding that U.S. companies act this way or that way. And so because of that, because the companies themselves, because of our system and our capital system and American companies say and how all this goes, they understand what you said, which is that there's going to be ramifications in this, right? The disruptions to not only disruptions to supply chains in the event of a trade war, but also the fact that a place like China is a materially significant part of their business operations and their revenue streams. Right? Almost every significant American multinational company now relies on the Chinese consumer, or either China already is maybe number 2 or number 3 biggest market for them, or they're planning on that it will get to that point. So in the event of a trade war where a Trump administration starts to make life very, very difficult for China in America, we would then expect China to retaliate, and they will, which then makes life extremely difficult for all these American companies that rely on China for their business, not just for the supply chain manufacturing that everyone knows about, but the fact that they're selling there. I mean, this is now, I mean, the story that is so often described in our media and our national narrative here is kind of old, right? The old story is, oh, American companies go to China to make things and then bring the products back here. That's the old story, right? That's not really the business model anymore. They're all over the place. They're in Vietnam, they're in Bangladesh, they're in India. They're all, it's a multinational issue, and the cost of doing of production in China has actually risen. Right? Labor costs in China are actually higher than they used to be. Nowadays, the story in China is that you're selling to China. You're selling to Chinese consumers. You're opening stores there. You're making products in China for Chinese. So if all of that suddenly becomes untenable because of a massive trade war and political tensions, American companies are going to be really, really hurt. Their stock prices are going to go down. They're going to be very angry. Everything is going to collapse. I mean, it's not going to accomplish anything positive for anyone.
And also like Trump, he's like people said it's probably gonna go really far, right? But international law also limits the scope of what the Trump, people can do. And but he said, maybe they go far, like even abandon like WTO.
Right.
Yeah.
So the WTO, I mean, that's a good example as well as another sort of lose-lose opportunity for the Trump administration. The United States has benefited so greatly from this rules-based trading order, and you have hundreds, however, 150, whatever the WTO membership is now, countries around the world that open themselves up to American business and American products and exports in a relatively rules-based way. So if Trump now says, well, we're going to abandon all that, maybe pull out or try to renegotiate because he doesn't like how the relationship works with one country, China, and then what? You're going to tear down the entire rules-based global trading order because of this one problem and pull the United States out of the WTO, or attempt to change it in a radical way that 150 other countries wouldn't want. Again, you end up in a lose-lose scenario where in order to sort of rectify one perceived imbalance, you tear down the entire structure. So but I would say that is also unlikely, right? These are talking points. More likely, but the WTO I think is fairly ensconced. I think that it's inconceivable that the United States could pull out of that. It would do way too much harm to ourselves. More likely, however, are things like the pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, attempting to renegotiate NAFTA. I don't really know exactly what that would even entail. It's unclear what about NAFTA the Trump people even find to be unfair. They hate it, but it's not clear what parts of it that they hate. But with the TPP, which has not started yet, I think it's pretty likely that that's dead and gone, right? It's very easy for the U.S. to pull out of that at this point. That was a major campaign talking point. It doesn't hurt Trump or the U.S. at all to pull out because it doesn't exist yet, right? You're withdrawing potential future gains. You're hurting future trade. I think it would be beneficial for the U.S. to join the TPP. Most economists do. But if they pull out now, the political damage would be limited domestically. It might be significant internationally, but limited domestically. So I think we can probably say that TPP is pretty much gone.
Yeah, you've been talking about this might hurt like American companies, right? But I think a lot of people who voted for Donald Trump, they kind of feel like corporation they make so much money, but we still not making lots of money, and so it doesn't do us any good. So that's why he sort of became like he sort of winning this election. So what's your take on this?
So you're absolutely right that, particularly in the Midwestern tradition, the handful of blue states that the Trump team was able to flip to red, Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and whatever, that message, and particularly the way that it related to trade, resonated. Right? Folks are saying, well, I guess free trade creates growth, and every economist says that it does, but we are worse off than ever. Right? And they're not wrong. So the problem is free trade does not distribute its benefits equally. There are winners and losers, and in aggregate, the country wins, but in specific communities, specific industries, they lose. And we as a nation have failed to provide any sort of alternative, or not any, but provide enough alternative job opportunities and retraining, et cetera. So if you're in certain areas and certain communities, you say the trade relationship with China has been nothing but bad, and they're almost right. I mean, they also have lower prices at local Walmart because of cheap imports from China, and so they benefit in that way. But it doesn't work out to their benefit if you've also lost your job and you never really got another one 10 years later that's anything close to as good. So they're right, and that anger is true. But whether or not Trump's diagnosis of what the problem is and the way to move forward is correct is highly questionable. Right? Every decent economist will tell you that technological change was a much more significant factor in the devastation of a lot of these communities and in the degradation of a lot of these American industries and manufacturing. Right? If those manufacturing companies and processes came back to the U.S. tomorrow, they wouldn't be rehiring all those millions of people. They'd be having robots do it. Right? Everything has changed. It's not the way it was in the 1950s or even the 1970s or even 15 years ago. Right? Fewer and fewer folks. Even these major announcements of some companies, creating a PR campaign around the fact that they are going to open a new factory here or they're not going to leave. You're talking about a few hundred jobs, right? Not 20,000 jobs, because it's mostly giant machines and technology doing the work. And then in the new industries that have emerged in the modern economy are also very, very tech heavy. It's just it's an unfortunate reality of how economics and productivity move forward. And what we as a society have to do is figure out how to help these folks that get left behind in all of that. Otherwise, they turn their anger on China. It's not China's fault that they have much, much cheaper labor input costs, at least for a while. And eventually the anger will shift again to Vietnam and Bangladesh, et cetera, right? Because pretty soon China is going to be too expensive, and that's going to move forward. But they're easy targets, and it's not entirely wrong, right? As I mentioned in the beginning, it's true for those communities in parts of the Midwest and certain other parts that they did really get a raw deal out of this.
And also, Trump, but Trump, he kind of boasted. He said, well, I stopped career and then fall from moving to Mexico, and seems to be working.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how true that's going to be in the long run, or whether or not these are PR announcements from some of these companies. I'm not all that familiar with the details. Some folks say it's been exaggerated, but ultimately that's not a sustainable way of a country running itself, at least not a free market country. There's going to eventually be blowback. Right? Again, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is Donald Trump trying to be an authoritarian, almost socialist type leader, where you as a politician demand that this company do X and this company do Y, and you pick winners and losers, and you decide how things are supposed to work. Well, that is anathema to free market capitalism, right? America is supposed to be a free market where companies and businesses pursue the most efficient and productive way to generate profits and return to their shareholders. That's our system. And I don't think that he can do this for very long until the conservatives and Republicans in Congress and around the rest of the country start to get a little bit angry at this, and companies themselves and CEOs. I mean, you will eventually start to see multinational American companies rise up and say, we can't make our business decisions based on, some guy's tweets. it's unreasonable. At the moment, it's working, right? At the moment, it appears to be working, or people are trying to brush it off, but this can't last.
And Mr. Navarro,
Yes.
and he said tariffs are not an end game, but merely one of several negotiation tools to bring our trade back into balance. You know, so I mean.
So you're referring to Peter Navarro, the professor at California, Irvine, who is the most extremist voice. And for many of us who were hoping that the Trump campaign's excessive rhetoric was just that, just campaign talk, one of the bellwethers, or one of the sort of post-election turn of events that we were watching for was whether or not Peter Navarro would be included in the Trump administration. So the optimists were saying, well, he's just ideological talk. He writes things that Donald Trump likes, but Trump won't put him into a position of power. Trump won't bring him into the administration because he's so extreme. His opinions are way, not just outside the mainstream. He's completely isolated, right? There isn't a single other serious economist in the entire world that agrees with his interpretation of how free trade works, or what the reality of the relationship between the U.S. and China is, right? He thinks, almost without exaggeration, that every significant problem in the American economy is China's fault, right? Every problem that we have could be solved if we simply either radically reoriented the trade relationship or simply cut off trade with China. To Navarro's perspective, a trade war would actually be a positive outcome because every single interaction with China causes nothing but problems, and every problem in the world is China's fault. So Navarro being that extreme, we thought, well, this isn't a campaign element. But in fact, to the disillusionment of all, Trump has put Peter Navarro onto his administration, right? He created a new institution called the National Trade Council, and Peter Navarro has been put forward to lead it. So in fact, he is apparently going to remain an insider, and this is alarming. This is a character who has crazy ideas on economics, and who has prescriptions that many folks would think would be just devastating to the American economy, and obviously China as well, and therefore the world. If this stuff went into, if he was able to sort of get his way in a legislative sense, there would be a global recession, almost certainly, because if you had that sort of devastating impact between the economic relationship of the world's two leading economic engines, everyone would go down with the ship for the most part. So it's disheartening that he apparently remains a significant voice in economic planning. We don't know how powerful he's going to be. We don't really know what this trade council even is. No one knows anything yet because Trump isn't even in power. But nonetheless, Peter Navarro seems to be here to stay, at least for now.
And his people also said, like to wage a trade war between the world's two biggest economies. Well, it's going to cost American jobs in the immediate terms, but eventually, it's going to create all those jobs again.
So that just seems extraordinarily unlikely. So the argument would be because they would raise costs to do business or to outsource to China. Therefore, the next option would be to simply come home. But that's completely unrealistic, right? If it becomes untenable to do business in or with China due to political outcomes, companies are not going to start manufacturing back in the United States. They're going to continue the process that has already begun, which is that you go to Vietnam, you go to Bangladesh, you go to India, you go to Indonesia, you go to Thailand, whatever. There's lots and lots of other steps that are going to be taken before you bring manufacturing back to the United States. And in fact, the primary manufacturing that might come back, again, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be the very tech-heavy kind, the kind that can leverage the advantages, the technical, logistical, maybe energy price advantages of doing business in the United States and manufacturing here, which means you're going to have factories that are filled with robots. But if you're interested in actually mass employment opportunities, then multinational companies are going to go where labor is cheapest, and that's never going to be the United States. So you will then have to start a trade war with every country in order and essentially become isolationist and protectionist. And that's the only way you absolutely force companies, right? If there's a 50% tax and tariff on every alternative location for outsourcing, then sure, they have no choice but to do business in America. But we know from history, unquestionably, that is only a route to recession and economic decline.
So being a member of WTO, he cannot really say, I'm going to raise like tariff on Vietnam because they make so much money from us. And then next like Indonesia, is he allowed to do that?
Well, no. Everything about the Trump philosophy goes against at least the principles of the WTO, the idea, the theory of it. And then, you sort of go line by line in terms of the rules. And so I think a lot of his sort of lashing out at China would be sort of retaliatory under the theory that China has been cheating in XYZ ways, and therefore we have a right to defend ourselves. But surely you can't apply that to every country in the world, right? And indeed, there would be an overwhelming amount of lawsuits and countervailing attempts within first. Maybe countries would try the WTO dispute resolution mechanism, or ultimately just unilaterally defend themselves, which essentially would render the WTO meaningless.
Yeah, but Trump even voiced like his suggestion about abandoning WTO. Work on WTO.
That has to just be rhetoric. It's almost inconceivable. Even for someone like Trump. He's benefited from the WTO in his own personal organization. Everyone has. I think that he might focus on China as a demonstration and go through sort of the channels, go through the time and effort to identify specific industries and sectors where China has perhaps egregiously pushed the limit, cheated, if you will, or at least maybe not upheld their own WTO obligations, and find specific scenarios wherein extreme tariffs could be applied that will enable Donald Trump to tweet some sort of success to his followers, show strength, and maybe make a difference in very targeted ways, right? So in steel or in agriculture or in auto parts, there are a handful of very hot button areas where China maybe has an unfair advantage, and maybe they're not living up to XYZ obligation because of subsidies, or because of otherwise not allowing free and fair competition domestically, and that's all true. China has plenty of ways that China is not a fair trade partner at all. So you identify those one at a time. You initiate very, very tough tariffs of the like that previous administrations were not willing to do, and then you celebrate that as a victory, but you don't make it a universal tariff, right? You don't say 45% on everything from China, because that then turns into the sort of devastating outcome that we described. So I could see that. So if you're going to watch out for something, you'd say they're going to do it sort of one at a time, and that also doesn't undermine the WTO.
And do you think that globalization already take a hit from all this drama?
Sure. That's a narrative of 2016. I think when historians look back at 2016, they're going to describe it either as a turning point where things really started to recede, or they're going to describe it as a moment in time when globalization paused because of this outcry. Right? This is an international story with Brexit, with all over the continental Europe, where you have sort of shifts to the right in populism, anti-foreigner sentiment, anti-immigrant sentiment all over the Western world, but even in places like the Philippines, there's a lot going on all over the world where you have regular folks saying, well, let's slow down here, right? And they're gonna have to be listened to, and that's completely reasonable. Now, can globalization really be turned back? A lot of us would say no, that's not really possible, but it can certainly be slowed down or paused in terms of the ever-increasing progress, right? The ever-increasing openness, ever more liberalization, ever more interconnectivity between economies and societies and peoples and ideas, and the force of the internet and everything like that. Maybe that can pause, but not really roll back. I don't think people would actually really approve of a real rollback in this kind of step. Maybe not such fast globalization.
But it seems like more and more countries are heading toward that direction. Brexit and like nationalism
Nationalism, yes.
kind of taking over.
It's alarming. Nationalism, populism, nationalism, whatever the word is, where you're essentially embracing some degree of a combination of xenophobia and our country first and us first, and even the right-wing leaders across various countries and societies actually sort of approve of one another. They cheer Trump and Trump cheers them, and vice versa. And the Brexit people and Duterte in the Philippines, et cetera, they all and even Putin, right? They give each other the thumbs up because they're all sort of agreeing that this globalization process and this interconnectivity, whether you're talking about values or economics or finance or whatever, should be slowed down, and everyone should be sort of minding their own business and taking care of their own issues at home. Unfortunately, what all economic experience and theory tells us is that if we start to roll this stuff back, it's not going to result in the positive outcome that folks are looking for. Right? Growth is going to slow down or decline or go into reverse. Jobs are not going to be created. Jobs are not going to come back. Folks might feel better about it, if more walls go up around the world, more borders are closed. It might improve people's emotional state in terms of feeding their nationalism, but it's not going to put more money in folks' pockets.
And we'll also have to ask you the question about China, Taiwan, America, because some people said Trump is like smart enough to use Taiwan as a bargaining chip.
Well, what do you think? I mean, some folks also think that Taiwan was smart enough to use Trump. So no one really knows exactly what happened with that phone call and who outsmarted who. Of course, Trump can retroactively create whatever storyline he wants about how intentional that was or what the plan was. Some of us think that he probably is just an inexperienced politician who doesn't really know that much about international affairs, probably didn't really know what he was getting himself into, and was just talking to every leader in the world without even really knowing their names or any background about the meaning of the call or what possible consequences or significance there could be. I tend to believe that. I think that it was all just very off the cuff, and I think that Taiwan, that Miss Tsai was the smart one there and took her moment and got it. But I don't know, right? No one really knows. No one knows how seriously he would actually try to use that relationship as a bargaining chip with China. He might. This is a little bit outside of the economics and business realm that we focus on. It's certainly alarming. I mean, as someone who used to focus on this kind of thing, I would suggest that that's not the way to go. Status quo seems to be fine for all parties, but Trump is Trump.
So, I mean, economically speaking, this is like more beneficial for Taiwan, or status quo is actually better?
I think that the status quo is better for Taiwan almost any circumstances, because it's become overwhelmingly reliant on mainland China's economy, and in the event of increased tension and strife that would come from greater support from the American administration, you would find China retaliating, which then would necessitate Taiwan to look for trade partnerships elsewhere. First of all, this is not a good timing for that, because it's unlikely that that the Trump administration or any other country is going to say, oh, well, what we want now is more free trade with anyone, right? So if you're Taiwan and you're in a difficult position, I would imagine that risking sanctions or less economic interaction with China is not likely to come out in a positive way for the sort of Taiwanese economic environment. But again, I don't focus too heavily on that. That's a little bit outside my area of specialty. But in general, I would say that just in U.S.-China relations over the last generation, the stability of the Taiwan question has been a win-win-win concern for everyone. And the world is a safer place because China and Taiwan have not been at each other's throats since 1996 or whatever the last time there was a serious flare-up. Obviously, there's tension there, but the fact that it's seemed to enter some sort of sustainable, stable status quo, I think has been beneficial for everyone, and it's an unnecessary risk to play around with that, from my perspective. But I'm on the outside.
Well, this is what I'm thinking too. Ethan, thank you so much.
Is that all right? Well, thanks very much for having me. It was fun.
Good job. I don't know. Like a lot of people also feel like when you said.
Well, what do your friends back home think? I mean,
Oh, we don't need more trouble. I mean, it's like a phone call, like also recognition. It's like we're gonna. It's like everyday people.
to mess around with the Taiwan issue as a way to sort of poke China. And that just, there's just nothing to be gained, you know. And they're going to get, I don't think he understands how emotional that issue is. It's just extremely, it's not like a business transaction. It's not like a trade negotiation, you know. This is an extremely emotional issue for everyone. What's that?
Hot button.
Yeah. Well, so, you know, we have to think about what is China really willing to fight about. And they're not going to fight about trade issues. They're not going to fight about economic issues at all. I don't even think they'd really fight about the South China Sea. But I think they would fight about Taiwan. So, you know, why would you go into that scenario? Like, I don't think he has any idea what he's doing.
No, I mean, status quo. I think maybe if our government keeps being so corrupted, it might not be a bad idea that China takes over.
Oh, don't say that. You would not like that. Wait, first of all, if corruption is what you're looking to get rid of, China is not what you want. Trust me, they're worse.
Really bad.
Yeah, it's just, I mean, it's unbelievably embarrassing how corrupt they are at all levels. I mean, they've thrown thousands and thousands and thousands of officials in prison for corruption, and there's still more. I mean, it's, you know. Yeah. Yeah, that's true. Part of the culture. At least in Taiwan, you can get rid of your leaders or put the old ones in jail, but in China they can't, you know. All right, well, this is fun.